Hi friends, so today we're going to be creating a Monet water lily watercolor project. I'm super excited about this. We're going to be learning about a lot of cool things, and Monet is one of my favorite artists, so we're very much going to have a great time with this. First off, I have my white piece of paper. If you have something thicker, better for the watercolor. If not, you can make do with what you do have. I have my watercolor palette. I did bring a bigger brush if you happen to have a bigger brush. If not, the small brush will be fine. Water, paper towels, pencil with an eraser, and then you can use either your oil pastels or crayons are fine. I brought a little bit of both. And then optional is a little bit of salt. We're going to do a little bit of a technique with the watercolor. So I'm going to start by scooting my supplies off to the side a little bit. Do want to mention also with that, I have something protecting the table. I'm going to start with my pencil. So we have our paper up and down, which is more portrait wise. And I'm going to start by drawing the bridge. So along with me, what we're going to do is we are going to, not in the middle, we're going to work our way up just a little bit, and we are going to place a curved line from one side of the paper to the other, just like that. Curved line, kind of like a little heel. This is going to be the top of our bridge. And then I'm also going to make that same line, but I'm going to do a little bit underneath it. And when I draw this, I want to try to keep the same amount of distance all the way from one side to the other. I'm also going to kind of draw the same line. This one's going to be very, very much closer. And then I'm going to do the same thing to my top one. Trying to keep the same amount of distance from one side to the other. It's the hardest part with that, but feel free to use your eraser, clean up your lines a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to place the poles on my bridge. So I'm just going to place a couple of lines, up and down lines. Trying to keep an eye on the distance between them. Have kind of equal spacing if possible. It's not going to be perfect. We're not measuring things out, and that's okay. We're just doing the best we can. All right, now that's kind of a great start to our picture with our bridge. We're also going to be adding some water lilies. We're going to be adding them below, above, and maybe a little bit in between these lines in the bridge as well. So when we are creating our water lily, we're going to start with kind of an oval shape. Somewhat like that. That's the lily pad. And then the flowers, the water lily flowers, we're going to come up. Have maybe some kind of curved, jagged lines, no specific amount, and then we're going to curve back down and make it kind of rounded at the bottom. And that exact shape right there, we're gonna kind of somewhat continue throughout to create these water lilies. Now, something important to note is when we draw our water lilies, when they are closer to the front, they're going to be a bit bigger. As they get further to the back, you want to try to draw them a bit smaller. So I might have some water lily pads that doesn't have the water lily flower on them. That's also an option, but you do want to try to stick to that size where they're bigger up here and they may be a bit smaller back there. So it is okay to space yours out however you like, but I am going to start to quickly, and you can as well, start to get down some water lilies, kind of starting with this oval shape that I can go back into and add the flower itself to. Trying to remember to keep that kind of gradual, smaller sizes in the back, kind of medium in this area. Some really small ones back here. Okay, that's a good amount. You can add as many as you'd like, really. Getting there. I like the way it's starting to, fill the page. There's a lot of spacing. Doesn't mean that the water lilies cover every teeny tiny part of it, but there isn't a lot of blank area. Okay, now I have kind of my water lilies spaced out. Now I can go into some of these water lilies and add in the water lily flower itself. You can do this kind of quick. Not all of them are going to look the same, so that's okay. I'm going to try to keep to this sizing where the flowers themselves would be much smaller back here than they are all the way up front. Kind of matching the size of the water lily pad itself. Now, I'm going to kind of finish up my flowers. I'm going to close in some of these pads, the lily pads. And then we're going to start to transition to the oil pastels or crayons. So if you're a friend who's already kind of wrapping up their bridge and their water lilies, it is okay to go ahead and start getting those ready. If you are kind of transitioning to getting those, I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about the colors. Now, typically when we are coloring in our water lilies, we're going to stick to more green colors, yellows, pinks, purples. Those are kind of the colors that are commonly found on the water lilies and their flowers, as well as maybe some white, and that's going to be fun, and we'll see kind of the effect that that creates later. So you can get those colors ready. On the bridge, we're going to be using some green as well. And then after we use our crayons or oil pastels, that's when we're going to transition to our watercolors here shortly. Okay, we're almost there, getting closer. Okay, now I am going to put my pencil aside. And I'm going to grab my colors. Now, I'm going to start with the bridge. I'm going to use a bit of a darker green for my bridge. If you're using oil pastels, awesome. If not, that's fine too. You'll find that they kind of color a little bit faster, a little more solid. That's what's nice about oil pastels. You will find though that they tend to be a bit more messier. So you do have to kind of watch your hand or your arm if you start to color or move over the top of the surface where you've used the oil pastels. But if you have your crayons, those will work fine for this project too. But I'm just filling in my bridge with a solid color. About halfway there on the bridge, and then we're going to move into coloring the water lilies. Okay, now on this I can go in with some other greens or blacks or whites, and I can kind of add maybe some lighter areas or some darker areas. Kind of give some cool shadows or effects to my bridge if I want to. Mine's just kind of blending it in with some lighter colors. Darker areas with my blue. I'm not completely coloring it in solid. We are going to be filling in the water area with the watercolors later, so we'll kind of leave that up to that. Okay, now we're going to start working on our lily pads. So I'm going to go in with my greens, kind of fill in the lily pad itself. Then I'm going to use my pinks, kind of purples and yellows on the flowers themselves. So I'm going to start with the greens. I go into the water lily pads, and kind of like what I did with the bridge, if I have more than one green, I can go in and add some lighter areas, darker areas. Blend it in a bit more. If you're a friend who's using oil pastels, it is important to know that when you have a little bit of a mess, maybe little sprinkles around it, it's better to give it a light blow so it blows out the surface instead of rubbing it, because if you rub it, it will smear some, okay? A lighter green. Okay, I'm gonna add some of that color on my water lily pads. So I'm gonna go in with my purple. Maybe get a bit of pink in there. Maybe even throw in a little bit of lighter area or white. Just like that. Beautiful. That was fun. Okay, now one last thing to note, and then I'm going to speed up this coloring portion just a little bit, is if I take my white, I know we can't necessarily see it right now, but if I imagine drawing like a couple little ripples, is what we'll call it. Imagine there's water around it and the lily pads moving just a little bit. We'll get kind of these lines around our work. It's creating these kind of little ripples that we can't see now, but when we go back into watercolor, it will resist the crayon area and we will be able to see those ripples some. So as I color this, I'm going to maybe add a few ripples around my lily pads as well. So what I'm going to do is I am going to do a little time lapse. It's going to quickly show Mrs. Mapula coloring all the water lily pads and water lilies. And then we're going to slow down a bit. So as you're coloring, as I'm coloring, you'll color too. But then we're going to slow down a bit, and then we're going to go on to the watercolor. So I will see you back in a couple minutes, and we will talk about the watercolor together. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to start working on the watercolor. So we're going to be using blue to paint in with watercolor the water in the image. Now, something important to note here is that when we're creating what's called values, so value means the lightness to darkness of a specific color. So in this case, we're using blue. So when something appears closer to you in an image, typically it's darker than when it kind of fades out further into the background with less details. So it's important to note, we talked about this earlier as well when we created the water lilies large and they gradually got smaller. This represents space in the image. So it represents distance from the front to the back. We're also going to do that by using value with the color we select, which is the blue. So in order to make the blue a bit darker down at the bottom, we're going to be using more color, more of the blue, and a little less water. Then when we get further to the back with the watercolors, we're going to be using more so the water and less of the pigment or the blue. But we're going to kind of prep our paper for this project, and you're going to be very careful with this because some of our some papers are a bit thinner, a little bit more flimsy. So you want to be really careful not to put too much water down on your paper. But I'm going to take my paper towel or my rag, whatever I'm using. I'm going to very, very carefully, because I don't want to get my table soaking wet, even if I need the help of my learning coach. I'm going to take this paper towel, I'm going to get it a bit wet, and I am going to actually dampen my paper. Now I see this is kind of lifting up my oil pastels a bit, my kind of crumbs, but it's okay. We'll be able to move those around a bit once we actually start using the brush. I'm not getting the whole table sopping wet, I'm getting kind of the surface of my paper wet and prepared to start adding the watercolor. Okay? Now I'm going to take my brush, set that to the side, take my brush, whether it's large or small. I'm going to add a little bit of water to my watercolor, my blue that I'm using. I'm going to add just a touch of this in there as well. And I am going to start with this near the bottom because it's going to be darker. As I get further to the top, I'm going to remember that I'm going to have more water than color. Okay. And I'm going to start down here. Now when I brush over my colors, it shouldn't cover them completely. It might cover them some, but because we use the oil pastels and the crayons, it should resist it a bit. Okay, so I'm just brushing over. It's kind of cool. It's starting to show our white crayon lines that we created in the background around our water lilies. We're just being careful and considerate of our paper, making sure we're not overloading it with the water or brushing it too much, because it can be easy at that point to rip our paper. We don't want that, right? So these little kind of old pastel crumbs or crayon crumbs, once our paper dries, we'll be able to brush those off a little bit easier. Because they are kind of tricky right now that they're wet into the paper. Okay, so I have quite a bit of color up front. And now I'm going to start making my way a little further back. Now, as I make my way further back, I'm going to try to keep my color a little lighter. So I'm going to have more water to my brush than color. I do want a little bit, but I want to be careful. Trying to keep it lighter values in the back. Now, once we've added our values from darker to light on our paper's still a bit wet, that's okay. Remember, we're gonna try to brush off or blow off any of those extra little pieces in the end. But if you are a friend who had the optional salt, I would encourage using this only if you feel like your paper is withstanding the water very well. It's not breaking down too much, doesn't look like it's about to rip. Because for this, you are going to go back in and add just a bit of water again. Very carefully. The paper is very wet at this point, and that's okay. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to take my salt, pinch it in my hand. If I have any cuts or anything in my hand, it can hurt, so be careful. Get the help of your learning coach if you need it. And then I am just going to kind of sprinkle it on my paper. And what this does is it kind of makes a little like crinkly kind of texture into my paper. But in order for this effect to work, even if you can't quite see it right now, we have to make sure our paper dries and sits completely still before we brush off that salt. So it has to stay still, it has to sit, and then once it's 100% dry, then I can kind of brush it off along with those kind of paper crumbs or oil pastel crayon crumbs on there. Okay, if I try to brush the salt now, it's just going to rub the paper, mess the paper up, and the effect won't work. So it's really important to let it sit after this. Now that the paper's dry, we can take a little bit of a closer look. I was able to brush off or blow off some of my oil pastel pieces. And then if we look a little bit closer, we can see some of the speckles from the salt effect. Can't wait to see yours.